Well now, good evening, friends. Andy Taylor here. What if I told you that two families in Mayberry, who'd been enemies for 30 years, suddenly found themselves under attack by a mysterious saboteur? And when I discovered who was terrorizing both families and why, the truth revealed a heartbreak so deep that one man had spent 3 decades plotting revenge against people who'd never wronged him. This is a story about bitterness that festers, about how unresolved pain can poison not just one life but entire families, and about the healing power of truth spoken after years of silence. It started on a Monday morning in April of 1962 when Robert Morrison came storming into my office, furious and demanding justice. "Sheriff," he said, "someone destroyed half my cornfield last night, trampled it down, ruined weeks of work. This is the 3rd incident in 2 weeks. First, our mailbox was knocked over, then paint thrown on our barn. Now this. I know who's doing it, and I want them arrested." "Who do you think is responsible?" I asked. "The Sullivans," he said with absolute certainty. "They've hated us for 30 years, and now they're finally acting on it. I want James Sullivan arrested immediately." I knew about the Morrison-Sullivan feud, of course. Everyone in Mayberry knew about it. The two families had been enemies for as long as I could remember, crossing the street to avoid each other, refusing to attend the same church services, their children forbidden from playing together. But I'd never known the reason for it, and neither had most people in town. It was just accepted that the Morrisons and Sullivans didn't get along. Now, however, someone was actively sabotaging the Morrison property, and Robert was convinced. It was the Sullivans seeking revenge for some ancient slight. I drove out to the Morrison farm and examined the damaged cornfield. Robert was right. Someone had deliberately trampled through the growing corn, destroying a significant portion of the crop. The destruction was methodical, not random. Someone had taken time and effort to cause maximum damage. I checked for footprints, tire tracks, any evidence that might identify the culprit, but found nothing definitive. Then I drove to the Sullivan place to talk to James Sullivan. James was a man in his early 60s, unmarried, living alone on a small farm on the other side of town. When I arrived, I found him working in his yard, and he was clearly upset about something. "Sheriff Taylor," he said before I could even ask my questions, "I need to report vandalism. Someone broke into my equipment shed last night and poured sugar in my tractor's gas tank. Ruined the engine. This is the 2nd attack on my property this month. Someone slashed my tires 2 weeks ago." I immediately thought of the Morrison accusations. "Mr. Sullivan," I said, "Robert Morrison claims you've been sabotaging his property." He shook his head vehemently. "The Morrisons are doing this to me, not the other way around. They're trying to drive me off my land, destroy my livelihood. It's been going on for weeks. Each family was convinced the other was responsible, each claiming to be the victim rather than the perpetrator. Over the next few days, the incidents escalated. The Morrison family's fence was cut, letting their cattle wander onto the road. The Sullivan property's irrigation system was sabotaged, flooding part of the field. Both families were preparing for confrontation, gathering relatives, talking about taking matters into their own hands. I knew I had to solve this quickly before the situation turned violent. I set up surveillance on both properties, enlisted Barney's help to watch through the nights, and waited to catch whoever was responsible. On the 3rd night of surveillance, I finally saw movement at the Morrison farm around 2 in the morning. A figure was approaching the barn with what looked like a can of paint. I moved quietly to intercept, flashlight ready, and called out for the person to stop. The figure froze, then slowly turned around. To my surprise, it wasn't a Morrison or a Sullivan, but James Sullivan's younger brother, Thomas. Except as I got closer, I realized it wasn't Thomas at all. It was James himself, wearing dark clothes, carrying red paint. "James Sullivan," I said firmly, "what are you doing here?" He looked at me with an expression that was part defiance, part resignation. "Finishing what should have been finished 30 years ago," he said quietly. I arrested him on the spot and took him to the station. Once there, with the evidence clear and his guilt undeniable, James began to talk. "Sheriff," he said, "I know what I've been doing is wrong legally, but morally, they deserve this. Both families deserve to suffer like I've suffered for 30 years. I didn't understand. Why would you sabotage both families?" I asked, "If you're angry at the Morrisons, why damage your own brother's property?" "Because," James said with bitter intensity, "they're all guilty. The Morrisons for what Sarah did to me, and my own family for taking her side, for telling me to move on, for acting like what happened wasn't the end of my world. So I've been attacking both sides, making them blame each other, watching them tear each other apart the way my heart was torn apart in 1932. 1932. That was 30 years ago. "James," I said gently, "what happened in 32? His face twisted with old pain. "Sarah Morrison and I were engaged to be married," he said. "We'd been planning our wedding for months. Everyone said we were perfect together. I loved her more than I'd ever loved anything. Then, 3 weeks before the wedding, she called it off. No explanation, no real reason given, just that she'd changed her mind. 2 months later, she married Robert Davis. 2 months. And then I found out why. She'd been with him while we were engaged. She was carrying his child. She'd betrayed me, lied to me, let me plan a future that was never going to happen because she'd already chosen someone else." The pain in his voice was as fresh, as if it had happened yesterday rather than 3 decades ago. "I was destroyed," he continued. "My family told me to forgive and move on. The Morrisons acted like I was overreacting, like Sarah had every right to change her mind. Nobody acknowledged how deeply I'd been hurt, how completely betrayed I felt. So I left Mayberry for a few years, tried to start over elsewhere, but I never married, never loved anyone else. Eventually, I came back because this is home, but the anger never left. It's been building for 30 years, and recently, seeing Sarah and Robert so happy, watching their children and grandchildren, seeing the life she built with him that should have been built with me, I couldn't stand it anymore. I wanted them to hurt like I hurt Dot. But James," I said, "you've been sabotaging the Sullivan property too, your own family." He nodded bitterly, "Because they abandoned me emotionally. When I came back to Mayberry, broken and bitter, they told me to let it go, to stop dwelling on the past. They invited the Morrisons to family gatherings, maintained relationships with them, despite knowing what Sarah had done to me. So yes, I attacked them too. I wanted everyone to suffer. I wanted the Morrisons and Sullivans to become enemies again, to tear each other apart. If I couldn't have peace, why should anyone else?" The depth of his bitterness was staggering. 30 years of unresolved pain had turned him into someone willing to destroy not just his enemies, but his own family. I kept James in custody and called for a meeting with both families. It took some convincing, but eventually I got Robert Morrison, Sarah Morrison Davis, and several Sullivan family members to come to the courthouse. I also insisted that Sarah's husband, Robert Davis, attend. When everyone was gathered, I explained what I'd discovered. James Sullivan has been sabotaging both families, I said. He's been trying to restart your feud, to turn you against each other. The reactions were mixed. Some Morrisons looked vindicated. Some Sullivans looked shocked and hurt. But Sarah Davis went very pale and quiet. I brought James out to face them all. He stood there, defiant and broken at once. Why? His brother Thomas asked. Why would you do this to us? James looked at Sarah. Because 30 years ago, he said, she destroyed my life and nobody cared. She lied to me, betrayed me, and then everyone acted like I should just get over it. Well, I never got over it. I'd spent 3 decades watching her live the life that should have been mine, and the anger finally became too much. Sarah stood up, tears in her eyes. James, she said softly, I owe you an apology I should have given you 30 years ago. What I did was wrong. I was young and scared, and I handled everything terribly. I should have been honest with you from the start, but I wasn't, and I've regretted that cowardice my entire life. She took a deep breath. I was seeing Robert before I called off our engagement. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. When I realized I was pregnant, I panicked. I couldn't marry you under false pretenses, couldn't build a life with you based on a lie. So I broke the engagement, but I never told you why, because I was ashamed. I let you think I'd just changed my mind, which was cruel. You deserved the truth, and I denied you that. I'm sorry. James listened, his face working through emotions. After a long moment, he spoke. For 30 years, I've imagined you as heartless, as someone who casually destroyed me without thought. But you were scared and young and made mistakes. I know that intellectually, but emotionally, the pain has been so overwhelming that I couldn't let it go. I let it define me. I let one betrayal become my entire identity. Robert Morrison, Sarah's father, spoke up. James, I owe you an apology too. When Sarah broke your engagement, I supported her decision without considering your feelings. I treated you as if you were owed nothing, not even an explanation. That was wrong. You were going to be my son-in-law, and you deserved respect and honesty. Thomas Sullivan put his hand on his brother's shoulder. James, we thought we were helping by telling you to move on. We didn't realize you needed to actually process the pain first, to grieve what you'd lost. We pushed you to forgive before you'd even begun to heal. That was our failure as a family. I'm sorry. The conversation continued for over an hour. People shared hurts, offered apologies, acknowledged failures. Sarah's husband, Robert Davis, spoke about how guilty he'd felt for 30 years, knowing he'd been part of causing James such pain. Sarah's adult children heard the story for the first time and expressed sympathy for James's loss. Slowly, painfully, truths that had been buried for 3 decades came to light. James wept at several points, releasing grief he'd held onto for so long that it had turned toxic. I still don't know if I can forgive completely, he finally said. 30 years is a long time to carry bitterness. It's shaped who I am. But I can see now that holding on to it has only hurt me more. I've wasted 3 decades on anger when I could have built a different life. That realization doesn't erase the pain, but it does make me see how much I've sacrificed to keep that pain alive. The legal consequences were complicated. James had committed multiple acts of vandalism and sabotage. Both families had the right to press charges. But after the emotional meeting, both Morrisons and Sullivans agreed not to prosecute if James would agree to make restitution for the damage he'd caused and seek help for his unresolved grief. James agreed. He worked over the following months to repair what he'd damaged, both literally and figuratively. He attended counseling, something he should have done 30 years earlier. And slowly, tentatively, the Morrisons and Sullivans began to heal their relationship that Sarah and James met privately several times over the following year. They would never be close friends. Too much history and pain between them for that. But they reached a place of mutual understanding and something like peace. James eventually acknowledged that Sarah's choice, while painful for him, had been her right to make. And Sarah acknowledged that how she'd made that choice, with lies and cowardice, had caused unnecessary additional harm. Both carried regret, but they stopped letting that regret poison their present. The two families, which had been divided for 30 years, slowly rebuilt connections. It started with cautious greetings, then progressed to conversations, then eventually to shared community events. Looking back on the case, what struck me most was how much damage unresolved pain can cause. James Sullivan's hurt was real and valid. He had been deeply wronged. But by refusing to process that hurt, by feeding it with bitterness and resentment for 30 years, he'd turned legitimate grief into something destructive. He'd hurt not just the people he blamed for his pain, but also himself and innocent family members. His revenge hadn't brought him peace or justice. It had only deepened his misery and spread that misery to others. The healing only began when the truth was finally spoken, when apologies were finally given and received, when everyone acknowledged the harm that had been done. The case also taught me about the importance of honesty, even when honesty is painful. If Sarah had told James the truth 30 years ago, it would have hurt him terribly. But it would have been a clean hurt, something he could have grieved and eventually moved past. Instead, the partial truth and the mystery surrounding her choice had left him with unresolved questions that festered into conspiracy and bitterness. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do, even when it's hard, is to be completely honest with people we've hurt. They deserve that. And we deserve the freedom that comes from not carrying secrets. Well, now, that's the story of the 30-year feud that was reignited by the very person most hurt by it, of how one man's unresolved heartbreak nearly destroyed two families, and of how truth and apology, even decades late, still have the power to heal. It's a reminder that pain we don't deal with doesn't just disappear. It transforms into something else, often something worse. And it's a reminder that revenge, no matter how justified it feels, ultimately hurts us more than it hurts those we're trying to punish. If you're carrying old hurts, old betrayals, old anger, I encourage you to find a way to address them. Talk to someone, seek help, do the hard work of processing and grieving. Don't let bitterness define your life the way James let it define his. And if you've hurt someone, even years ago, consider offering a genuine apology. It might not change everything, but it might change something. It might allow both of you to finally move forward from a past that's been holding you both prisoner. Come back and visit again real soon, friends. Until then, this is Andy Taylor saying good night from Mayberry. Remember, forgiveness isn't about saying what happened was okay. It's about refusing to let what happened continue to hurt you. Take care now.